people who are against Jair Bolsonaro were protecting themselves because of the threat of COVID-19, and actually that made the streets a monopoly of pro-Bolsonaro forces, because he's the, like Paulo's report just showed, the #1 denier of COVID-19 in Brazil. But tensions have escalated to a point where left-leaning protesters said, well, despite of the risk, let's go out and let's show that the streets are not only for the right wing to protest and to demonstrate. And actually, we were afraid that maybe we would have confrontation today. But actually, in 12 states, most protests ended up in a very peaceful way.
The death of a 5-year-old boy, a black boy whose mother, a maid, entrusted her white employer with the child. The child fell from the 9th floor of a high-rise building where the mother was working. That seems to have added flames to the fire amid accusations of racism. We saw in Paulo's report there Portuguese signs indicating Black Lives Matter in that report. How much of these demonstrations are coronavirus? How much of this is race? How much of this is anti-Bolsonaro in general?
Well, it's a mix of everything because, like you mentioned, the case of this 5-year-old boy just exposed a lot of the race issues we have in Brazil. But we also had a couple of weeks ago a 14-year-old boy, a black kid that was shot at in his house by the police. His house was shot at 80 times. The police then disappeared with the body for hours, and the family would only find him in the morgue. So that we have had some textbook cases of race issues in Brazil. In Brazil, if you're black, you're going to earn much less than white people. You're going to live shorter. The life expectancy is much shorter. And actually, we have seen the process against police brutality in the U.S., but the Brazilian police actually killed 17 times more people than the U.S. police in 2019. So police brutality, and it is skewed much more towards racial minorities. So all of that adds fuel to a state of social unrest we have in Brazil so far, because we have economic crisis, we have a humanitarian crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. So everything fuels to a level of deep dissatisfaction right now.
In Sao Paulo, we saw supporters of two of the most competitive teams. Their rivalry is known in the world of football. They joined forces against fascism. They got into clashes with supporters of Bolsonaro. What was all that like?
Well, organized ultra supporters in Brazil are very political. Actually, these groups started for political reasons, and they do a lot of social work. So it was not that shocking for people who follow these groups to see that they went very political. Last week we saw confrontations with groups, but the police said that it was because a couple of pro-Bolsonaro supporters with fascist symbols, bearing fascist symbols, they started heckling these groups. But none of that happened. Today, protests happened very peacefully.
In a very Trump-like manner, Jair Bolsonaro has had some very endearing words for his supporters, but quite harsh words for his critics. So where does all of this go from here?
Well, it's very, we have a big question mark is how the government is going to react once these protests just become larger and more frequent, if they do. Because like you said, Jair Bolsonaro, in a very Trump-like way, called them terrorists and said that the police should straighten them up. So we don't know how things will play out, especially because the police is highly politicized right now and very aligned with Jair Bolsonaro. Today was a good example. We didn't see many confrontations. And there's also the fact that police forces in Brazil are state forces. And right now, state governors are opposing Jair Bolsonaro, most of them. So that also adds to the fact that it's in the governor's interests and many of them have presidential aspirations, to let the protest play out and let a dissatisfaction with Bolsonaro become more apparent.
Gustavo Ribeiro from the Brazilian Report, thanks so much for joining us.